Hello! This video is all about how I got this guy to go from being a full-time breastfed, on-demand, co-sleeping baby to sleeping all night in his own cot. This didn't happen over the course of a week. This is quite a long process and I'm going to break down every stage for you. I have kind of shied away from how-to videos in the past because my routine is pretty chaotic. A lot of the time we don't have one and I've always kind of just gone with the flow and done whatever's easiest. But what I have realised is that I've had 3 children who were all pretty awful sleepers as babies and toddlers, and I have got 3 toddlers through that process of waking a lot in the night through to sleeping through in their own bed. So I do have quite a bit of experience on the subject, and I thought I would just do this video to run through the stages of how we've done that with Otto just recently. I did a video a little while ago about Otto's nighttime routine at 16 months, and in that video I said that he's not quite sleeping through yet, but I had a feeling that he would get there soon. Well, now I am really pleased to report that he is in fact sleeping through the night. We still do have some odd nights where he wakes up, but for the most part I would expect him to sleep through. I also wanted to say that I've often tried to follow these sort of stages that I'm going to talk about in the past before my babies were quite ready, and it made me feel a little bit crap and wonder what I was doing wrong. Baby sleep is not prescriptive. All children are different and there's never going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. But I do think that these sort of how-to videos can be really useful if you think that your baby or toddler might be ready and you're just not quite sure how to approach it or where to start. So I'm going to break down how we got Otto to sleep through the night in stages. If the stage isn't relevant to you because maybe you're not breastfeeding or you're not co-sleeping, you can just skip on to the next stage. Not all the stages are going to be relevant to everybody. But if you want to hear how we moved from breastfeeding on demand and co-sleeping full time to sleeping all through the night in his own cot, then here it is. So, step 1. I have always let my babies in the early months feed on demand and feed until they were fast asleep before I put them down. So the very first step was to get Otto falling asleep without feeding to sleep. He has always been a pretty easy, good-natured baby, so I was actually able to do this at around 6 or 7 months, which is a hell of a lot earlier than I was doing it with their older brothers, who didn't really get to that stage where they would fall asleep happily without feeding until they were probably around a year old. I stopped feeding him to sleep. Instead, I would feed him until he was drowsy, and then I would give him a cuddle and walk him around until he fell fast asleep on me, and then I would transfer him to the cot. I actually also stopped feeding him in the bedroom full stop because I didn't want him to associate the bedroom with having milk, so we'd have his last feed downstairs and then we'd go up and start the bedtime routine. So after he'd gotten used to falling asleep not on the boob anymore, step number 2 was to cut down his feeding time. What used to happen was whenever his first wake up was during the night, which was usually around 2 to 3 hours after I'd put him down for bed, all sleep training would go completely out of the window. He wasn't having any of it and he would just come into bed with me and sleep next to me and feed on demand until the morning. I didn't really feel like he was ready for this step until he was around 11 months old, and with my older children it was more like 18 months old, so it just shows you that there's a real variation in when a baby or toddler might be ready for these steps. So what I did was I would still let him come into bed with me and have a feed when he woke up, but I would not let him feed until he was completely asleep, that he just sort of fell off the boob. I would take him off when I felt that he'd had enough of a feed that he could get back to sleep. And usually he would have a bit of a grumble about this, and I might have to get up and walk him around a bit or rub his back or do something to help him get to sleep. But the important thing was that he wasn't needing to feed until he was completely, fully asleep. This stage did take a bit of persistence and lasted quite a long time, but eventually, once he realised that he wouldn't get any more milk, he did start to get the hang of it. These steps aren't really like an overnight thing and then you move on to the next thing after like a day. This is a much more long-term sort of thing. Some of these steps we really took our time over. So step 3 was to get him sleeping longer periods in his cot than he was sleeping next to me in my bed. I enlisted Sam's help for this, and we decided that for one of his wake-ups during the night we would try to resettle him in his own cot rather than just straight away bringing him into bed with me. We tried this with his first wake-up, which was usually around somewhere between 10 and 11 o'clock, and he was having none of it. He would cry and cry and cry and get really angry, and we'd be up there for sometimes about 2 hours before we managed to settle him, and then he'd only go down for about 20 minutes, and then the same thing would repeat and repeat and repeat. So we just decided it wasn't working at that time. But we did have more luck with his sort of 3 o'clock, around that point, wake up. At that point I found that if I fed him, he would generally be happy enough to be picked up and walked around his room, and then we could resettle him in the cot. So we decided to focus on that wake up. And after a while he started sleeping from 3 o'clock till about 6 or 7 in the morning in his own cot. So now we just had the middle of the night to crack, that period from around 10, 11 till about 3 in the morning. He was still getting quite upset when we tried to resettle him in his own room rather than bring him to me at that point. So I decided the best thing was to focus on bedtime and getting him to fall asleep by himself in his cot. At this point we were still walking him around the room until he was fast asleep and then putting him in the cot. Going from my experience with my older 2 boys, I thought that if we could get him to fall asleep by himself happily at bedtime, we might have a better shot at cracking that 11 o'clock wake up. So we had a few tools that we used for bedtime to help Otto fall asleep by himself. One of these was white noise, which I've been using since he was a very young baby, and the other thing, which I've also been doing ever since he was little, just to try and get him to subconsciously realise that it's bedtime, was to sing the CBeebies bedtime song to him. During this point when we were trying to get him to fall asleep by himself in his cot, I'd find that I would have to wait until he was really truly tired to attempt this, because if I did it any earlier he would either get upset or he'd think it was playtime and he'd keep standing up again. If he did get up and try to play, I would leave the room for a few minutes. Sometimes I found that a little bit of crying would actually help get him in the mood for sleep, but I'd only let him cry if it was a grumbly cry, and if it escalated into anything else I was in there straight away, because not only did I not want him to feel like his room wasn't a safe space, I wanted him to feel like this is my safe space, it's my nice sleepy room. I didn't want him to feel like this was somewhere he gets put to cry, so I never really wanted him to cry lots and lots, so I'd always go back into him. And also I found that if he started crying seriously, it always took a lot longer to get back to a stage where he was ready to fall asleep, so I just didn't want that to happen at all. So our routine at this point was I'd put on his white noise, I'd sing the bedtime song, and then I'd walk him around the room and give him a cuddle for a few minutes, and then I'd lie him down in his cot on his tummy, because he's a tummy sleeper, and I would just rub his back gently until he fell asleep. Sam would also do this stage too, because I felt it was really important that Otto didn't get reliant on just one of us doing part of his routine. Instead of white noise, Sam found his own ways to help Otto get to sleep, and he'd actually put on the baseball highlights to watch when he was in the room with Otto, and this was actually the time that Otto first fell asleep on his own without anyone in the room. He'd left the baseball highlights on, gone to do something, came back, and Otto was fast asleep after watching baseball. So for a while, watching baseball highlights at bedtime became Otto's thing. I really think that if you find something that works, even if it's a bit weird, just go with the flow. If it helps, just do it and don't question it. So step 4 was to get Otto to go to sleep in his room by himself without us there doing anything major like rubbing his back. I wanted to get to a stage where I could put him down and leave the room. We found that after a few weeks of either the back rubbing or the watching the baseball, we could kind of step back and back and back further, and eventually we were leaving the room and he was generally not crying. He would just quietly go to sleep by himself, which I thought was amazing. I've never had a child until Otto who's done this. With the older ones, they never quite reached that stage until they were, I think, 2.5. So to have Otto at kind of 14, 15 months, just quietly going to sleep happily by himself, and the bedtime routine I'm used to is about an hour long, whereas this was a quick 15 minutes, get him in his bag, give him a cuddle, lie him down, leave the room. I couldn't believe it. I was loving it, and I'm still loving it. I haven't gotten over that yet. So on to step 5, we still had that 11 to 3 AM slot to tackle. He was still waking at that point, even though he was falling asleep by himself. This was now the only part of the night where he'd come into my bed and have milk. I figured that now he was falling asleep happily by himself at bedtime, I thought we'd have a much better chance at attempting that 11 o'clock wake up, and I was right. The next time we attempted to settle him in his own room, he was happy to be picked up, have a cuddle, walked around and then put back in his cot asleep. None of the stubbornness that he'd been giving us a few months earlier. He was now sleeping the whole night in his cot. He was still waking up about 1 to 3 times a night, but he was sleeping the entire night in his cot, and he was not feeding anymore at night. So step 6 was really our attempt to get him to reduce his wake-ups now. He was now sleeping all night in his own cot, but he was still waking up. We were still going in to resettle him quite a lot, and the next step was to try and get him sleeping through the night. Sam and I would alternate the wake-ups. We'd take turns just to make sure that each of us were getting a decent amount of sleep every night. We stuck to this pretty rigidly, as we didn't want to have a backslide at this point. So even when I got really ill with tonsillitis, we still stuck to getting up and dealing with him, even though it would have been far easier to bring him into my bed at that point. I found that this stage in particular was really where I had to find some inner motivation to keep going with it, because it would have been so easy to go back to our old ways, especially when we were exhausted and ill, but it also would have been so frustrating to step back, and I know that I would have been pretty annoyed with myself. I think one of the most important things to remember, and it's something that I always try and think about when I've been really frustrated or exhausted because of lack of sleep, is that if you're not happy with any aspect of your current nighttime routine, you can always take steps to change it. So now on to step 7, which is the final step and also the most simple step, because it is just time. I truly believe that the biggest component in helping your baby or toddler sleep better at night is just simply time. Sometimes you just have to wait it out. Sam and I carried on with going into Otto's room to resettle him for weeks. We didn't know when he was going to start sleeping longer stretches or sleep through the night, but we just knew that it had to happen at some point. Eventually, after just over a month, I think, it started to happen. We noticed that we were spending less and less time resettling him, and he was mostly going down without a fight. And then the sleep stretches started getting longer, and we actually noticed that there were more nights where we didn't have to go into him than ones where we did. At the moment, he sleeps through the whole night about 85% of the time. That is my completely made up number that sounds about right. And on the nights that he doesn't, he's really easy to resettle generally. It usually takes around 5 minutes, if that. If he's ill, the entire plan goes out of the window and we just do whatever's easiest. Then I usually find that he tends to go back to his good sleeping ways pretty quickly after that, so I try not to worry about making any bad habits. I honestly think a lot of it is purely down to time, but there are a couple of things that I think have definitely helped us along the way, and those are consistent bedtime routine and consistent bedtime cues, and helping my children to learn how to fall asleep by themselves. I'd love to know who got all the way to the end of this video, because I reckon you guys are the ones who are feeling the most frustrated and the most sleep deprived. So leave me a comment, let me know how old your baby or toddler is, and please give this video a thumbs up if it's helped you feel motivated to try and start helping your baby or toddler sleep a little bit better. I really hope that you will be getting more sleep very soon, and just remember, if you try something and it's not working, it's not the end of the world. It might just be that they're not ready for that step yet. Yeah, is that funny? Are you funny?